Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 10 running back rankings for the 2024 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, we're covering all topics related to the running back position, beginning with matchups. Then I'll go ahead and transition into talking about my top 40 running back rankings. If you're looking for my thoughts on an individual player, please travel down to the description of the video. Down there, like we have in every single video, there are timestamps available, so you can fast forward to the section that includes the running backs that you have on roster. Outside of that, at the end of today's episode, I'll also be talking about the trade deadline and all the trades that were made earlier today, specifically the two players, Khalil Herbert and Mike Williams, and their overall adjustment in terms of their value and how we want to prioritize them going into the tonight's overall waiver wire. So I'll include that within the timestamps as well. Again, later tonight, I'll be live streaming here on the channel starting at 7 p.m. PST if you want to hear further thoughts regarding those players, but I'll also include it in today's episode in case you're not able to make that live stream. Again, like I've talked about in the past, I live stream every single day on the channel. So if you guys have not yet already, be sure to subscribe and of course click the bell notification button to know exactly when I'm live. Thank you very much for all the support. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin by talking about matchups at the running back position going into week 10. So we've gone ahead and accumulated running back rushing statistics allowed from weeks 1 through 9 by each individual defense and continue to find that the Carolina Panthers, New England Patriots, Cowboys, Dolphins, Saints, Bears, etc. are the most advantageous matchups going into any given week at the running back position based on rushing statistics allowed, rushing yards, and rushing touchdowns. Therefore, we're going to take advantage of these overall matchups. Tyrone Tracy taking on the Carolina Panthers. DeAndre Swift, the thumbnail of today's episode, taking on the New England Patriots. We're firing these players up because, again, they're taking on defenses that cannot stop the run. Now, on the other end of this overall conversation, we have some of the more difficult matchups at the running back position in terms of overall yardage on the ground. I mean, the Kansas City Chiefs are allowing just 3 yards per carry to opposing running backs thus far this season. The Baltimore Ravens, the Chargers, the Vikings, all incredible teams against the run. Therefore, we want to be careful with these overall matchups and keep that in mind. I'll reference back to these statistics over the course of today's episode. But with this all covered, let's go ahead and transition into talking about my top 40 running back rankings. And before I do so, again, a reminder, while you're down in the description, be sure to check out Underdog. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make that first time deposit minimum of $10, not only will you be able to claim the first time deposit offer and get my rankings every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. Again, these rankings by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, includes flex, all-encompassing rankings, but you're also going to be able to potentially tail some of the picks we make over the course of the week, whether it's on the Hidden Gems episode, whether it's the weekend streams, or even yesterday's picks that ended up hitting for the NFL slate of games. Again, if you guys are interested, be sure to sign up today. Check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility by your current location. If in fact you are eligible, again, take advantage of it. But if you are not, because you've used the code in the past or your current location does not allow for it, again, you can always find rankings via the Patreon. Link is also down in the description. Thank you very much for all the support. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's talk about my top 40 running back rankings for week 10, beginning with our number 1, Saquon Barkley, taking on the Dallas Cowboys. Again, the Dallas Cowboys, like we talked about just moments ago, they're the third best matchup at the running back position. They're allowing 18.36 fantasy points per game on the ground alone. Not only that, but they're not going to have Dak Prescott this week, so Cooper Rush will be their starting quarterback. It's going to be a positive game script, so a lot of rushing in the second half for the Philadelphia Eagles, and the Dallas Cowboys defense has been dealing with a plethora of injuries to their primary starters. Therefore, Saquon Barkley should be in line with another great performance. But unfortunately, over the course of this entire season, we have seen multiple scenarios in which Saquon Barkley hasn't met his overall upside due to the overall utilization of Jalen Hurts down in the red zone. Jalen Hurts has scored 6 rushing touchdowns in the last 3 games. In the 4 games this season in which Saquon Barkley has scored touchdowns, he's averaging 30.23 fantasy points in those 4 games, while in the other 4 games in which he hasn't scored any touchdowns, only averaging 11.55 half PPR fantasy points per game. We're expecting this week to be one of those weeks in which Saquon Barkley is easily able to find himself in the end zone once, if not twice, and have himself an upside performance as our number 1 overall running back. Number 2 is our running back, Devon Achane, running back of the Miami Dolphins. Devon Achane with Tua Tagovailoa under center is a completely different running back. I mean, this entire offense is extremely elevated when Tua is under center, but Devon Achane specifically has taken, jumps ahead of all other options like Tyreek Hill, Jaylen Warren, Raheem Mostert, etc. Over the course of the last 4 games with Tua, Devon Achane has had himself a minimum of 6 receptions every single game. Now, not only that, in terms of the overall fantasy point production in those last 4 games, 19.5, 26.0, 23.7, and 28.1. In the 4 games with a healthy Tua this season, he's averaging 24.33 fantasy points per game in a half PPR, and now has an opportunity of taking on the Los Angeles Rams, who are the 11th best matchup at the position, allowing 15.44 fantasy points per game. Devon Achane is getting it done on the ground, highly efficient in the overall opportunity he is given between the tackles, but not only that, if he's going to continue to get himself 6+ receptions every single game, the upside of overall potential in a half PPR, full PPR continues to grow. Therefore, he sits as our number 2 going into the upcoming matchup. Number 3 is Joe Mixon. Look, Joe Mixon continues to ball out every single week. He is on a consecutive streak of 5 games in a row now, when healthy, that he has gone over 100 total yards and 1 touchdown minimum. And this week, even though he takes on the Detroit Lions, we have seen the Detroit Lions have been terrible in terms of stopping the run as of the course of the last month here in the National Football League. Obviously, a couple injuries have to do with that, but in comparison to the Detroit Lions of the past, this was not a common thing. But as of this season, it definitely is. We've most recently seen Seattle Seahawks running backs 95 rushing yards, 3 rushing touchdowns. Minnesota 97 and 1 rushing touchdown. Tennessee 126 on the ground. Green Bay 136 and a touchdown. Joe Mixon is expected to have himself another major week, and with Nico Collins potentially returning this week, it provides even more upside for this offense to find Joe Mixon within the end zone. Number 4, we have Derrick Henry. Look, Derrick Henry, every single game out, has the option and the opportunity of scoring 20-plus fantasy points because of how incredibly well this offense has played and the advantageous positions this offense puts themselves in to run the ball late in games. Derrick Henry coming off of another week in which he had over 100 total all-purpose yards and a touchdown, 9 consecutive weeks of 1 touchdown minimum. Again, every single week, I've taken advantage of Derrick Henry via Underdog. Going with an entry of him scoring an anytime touchdown seems automatic. They take on the Cincinnati Bengals this upcoming Thursday night. Yes, it is a short week, but the last time out against the Cincinnati Bengals, 15 carries for 92 yards, 1 rushing touchdown, 16.1 fantasy points. We're expecting another big week here for Derrick Henry. Our number 5 is, in fact, the return of the king. It is Christian McCaffrey. Now, I don't know what kind of capacity he is going to be at in his first week back with the San Francisco 49ers offense. I'm going to hope that he is going to be unleashed and he's going to finish as the number 1 overall running back, because for those of us who have him on roster, we certainly need that kind of production in order to get ourselves into the fantasy playoffs. But Christian McCaffrey's back. Do I need to remind you what he's capable of? I mean, last season in games in which he played, over 70% of the offensive snaps throughout the regular season. He was averaging 23.85 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. This week, they take on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who we just saw last night, Kareem Hunt and the boys. Yes, even though they went to overtime, 125 yards on the ground, 1 rushing touchdown. Even Samaje Perine got himself utilization through the air, a receiving touchdown. Those are the kind of numbers that we're potentially going to see from Christian McCaffrey going into the week in an advantageous overall matchup. Obviously, coming off the bye, this offense will be healthy and ready to roll. Our number 6 to begin the A tier is Bijan Robinson, running back of the Atlanta Falcons. Look, Bijan Robinson has been incredible, and even though we had the classic Tyler Allgeier steals the touchdown from Bijan Robinson last week, it doesn't really matter. Bijan Robinson is coming off of the most touches he has had in a single game this season. 26 total, 19 carries on the ground, 7 targets for 7 receptions. And even though he did score 18 fantasy points, we were all hoping for the potential of that touchdown going in his direction and him tacking on 25 plus fantasy points. And again, he is certainly capable of accomplishing that this week against the New Orleans Saints, because again, we've talked about it. The Saints are the 5th best matchup in terms of running back rushing statistics allowed, 17.31 fantasy points per game thus far this season. Back in week 4, even though Bijan Robinson didn't take advantage of the overall matchup, only had 7 carries for 28 rushing yards, 4 catches for 46, and 9.4 fantasy points. I'm expecting a completely different switch, because since week 6, Bijan Robinson has been averaging 22 touches per game and 20.98 fantasy points per game in a half PPR. We're expecting a lot of upside from Bijan this week. Number 7, we have Kyren Williams, who's coming off of a week in which he didn't score a touchdown. This is the first time all season in which he did not score a touchdown, whether it was on the ground or through the air. And even though he was given his opportunities, he was stuffed on the goal line on multiple occasions over the course of this entire game. But that's going to be a rare instance in the grand scheme. Kyren Williams is going to find himself in the end zone more often than not, just like he did last season. This week, he has an opportunity of getting back into the end zone, taking on the Miami Dolphins in the Monday night matchup. The Miami Dolphins are the 4th best matchup at the running back position, allowing 17.88 fantasy points per game on the ground. As of late, they've allowed 87 rushing yards to the Buffalo Bills, 63 in a touchdown to Arizona, 87 in a touchdown to Indianapolis, and 141 in a touchdown to the New England Patriots running backs. The expectation going into the matchup this week with a healthy Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua back, obviously hopefully not getting ejected once again, DeMarcus Robinson, obviously balling out. This offense is going to continue to churn out a lot of fantasy points, and a lot of them going in the direction of Kyren Williams this week. Number 8, we have Alvin Kamara. Look, even though it seems as if the Saints are going in the opposite direction, firing their head coach, trading Marshawn Lattimore earlier this afternoon, Alvin Kamara is still going to be a relevant option. He just signed a 2-year extension. He's gotten his money. He's going to continue to ball out. And he's coming off of a week in which he set a career high for the most overall rushing yards in his entire career and most overall touches within a singular game. 155 rushing yards, and 35 total touches, 29 rushing attempts, and 6 receptions on 9 targets. Again, earlier this season, back in week 4 against the Atlanta Falcons, 19 carries for 77 and a touchdown, 7 catches for 42 and 21.4 fantasy points and a half PPR. Kendre Miller's dealing with an injury. Jamal Williams is dealing with an injury. And even though there's always the threat of Taysom Hill stealing a touchdown, Alvin Kamara is implicated for a solid week here against their division rival within the Atlanta Falcons. Number 9, we have Jahmyr Gibbs. Look, Jahmyr Gibbs, even though he didn't play a single snap until the beginning of the second quarter, you got to remember, this entire offensive drive in the first quarter was just about setting the tempo. They brought out David Montgomery and they jammed the ball down the Green Bay Packers' throats. And that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to establish that we're going to run the ball and we're not afraid of you. And they continued to pound the rock all the way down the field. And even though Jahmyr Gibbs wasn't given any sort of exposure opportunity in the first quarter, in the last 3 quarters of the game, scored 14.1 fantasy points and even could have had more overall production if this offense wanted to. Typically, the Lions have been a team that just want to come out and embarrass defenses, and that's what they have done over the course of this entire season. Even though they weren't able to take it to the next level against the Green Bay Packers, which they definitely were trying to do so, again, Jahmyr Gibbs is always implicated to be a touchdown scorer within this offense, scoring 7 touchdowns in the last 6 games, getting himself the ample opportunity. And even though David Montgomery had himself a lot more touches in the overall conversation, it was mainly because of the weather and the overall circumstance within the matchup. Number 10, we have DeAndre Swift, the thumbnail of today's episode. Look, DeAndre Swift is getting elite opportunity on a continual basis. 18 plus touches in the last 5 games. He's been averaging a total of 21.4 touches per game. But as long as those opportunities continue to go in his direction, understand that the Patriots, again, top 3 matchup in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs. Not only that, but if we talk about the most recent performances of running backs against the New England Patriots one-stop defense, San Francisco 123 and a touchdown, Miami 184 and a touchdown, Houston 185 and 2 touchdowns, Jacksonville 156, 2 touchdowns, the New York Jets 112 in a touchdown, and Tennessee last week 150 rushing yards on the ground from their running backs. The expectation is that DeAndre Swift should have himself an incredible performance against the New England Patriots run-stop defense, which again does not exist as of thus far this season. Number 11 is Breece Hall. Look, Breece Hall, even though he has been relatively quiet in the absence of scoring touchdowns, his overall yardage has been decent. I mean, majority of it coming from the rushing game because he has been given a lack of overall exposure within the receiving game, which again, at times, they give him 5+ receptions, and then at times they completely ignore him. It is very difficult to predict the overall workload that we're going to see on a consistent basis from Breece Hall, considering there's so much volatility as of thus far this season. But again, 85 and 89 total yards in the last 2 games are not a problem. It's just a matter of, is he going to score a touchdown? I think patience is the way to go with Breece Hall. Again, we know he's extremely talented, and we know that this offense starts slow and it doesn't help them. But in the second half of games, they're continuing to kind of pick it up. They take on the Cardinals, which again is a top 10 matchup at the running back position. They've allowed their fair share of statistics to running backs as of late. 137 on the ground to Green Bay, 134 to Miami and 2 touchdowns. And even though the Chicago Bears offensively could not move the ball at all, whether it was on the ground or through the air last week, I expect Breece Hall and of course this New York Jets offense to put up a better fight in the overall circumstance and have himself a solid performance from the RB1. Number 12 is Aaron Jones. Over the course of the last 2 weeks, even though he has, very similar to Breece Hall, not scored a touchdown, he has been highly relevant in terms of the overall touches he has gotten. 21 and 25 touches in the last 2 games. And even though a lot of the overall touchdowns within the red zone are play action pass, in which Sam Darnold is finding a flurry of players that don't really need to be catching the balls, Jalen Nailor doesn't need to continue to score touchdowns for this team. Throw it to Jordan Addison, Justin Jefferson, Hawkinson, maybe even sprinkle a couple in the direction of Aaron Jones. Please, for fantasy purposes, we're begging you. But this week they take on the Jacksonville Jaguars. Again, it's a middle-of-the-pack matchup based on fantasy points per game allowed, 14.4. But in terms of the overall production against this run-stop defense as of late, ridiculous numbers have been put up against them. Philly, of course, this most recent week, 168 and a touchdown. Green Bay the week prior, 148 and 2 touchdowns. Chicago the week before that, 99 and a touchdown. Aaron Jones should be in line with a huge performance this week. Number 13, we have James Cook. And even though James Cook, very similar to Breece Hall and Aaron Jones, didn't score a touchdown this last week, he was given the opportunity. It wasn't like the opportunity did not exist. He was given an opportunity inside the 5-yard line. Unfortunately, was not able to convert, and then it led to a Matt Collins receiving touchdown. Again, they're going to knock on the door. And if, in fact, they get into a third down situation and they don't feel comfortable doing so, they will not hand him the ball. But luckily, he was able to kind of salvage his overall week with 6 targets, 5 catches, 25 receiving yards. But again, if it wasn't for the fact that he didn't score that touchdown, if he had scored the touchdown, he scores 15 points, nobody's complaining. And that's kind of the numbers that we expect. 15 to 20 points within a given week for the capabilities of James Cook. As long as the rushing and receiving opportunities are given to him, which they typically are on a given weekly basis, the touchdown is the unlock to getting him into the top 12 conversation every single week. They take on the Indianapolis Colts, top 10 matchup, 15.5 fantasy points per game allowed to opposing running backs. Minnesota ran for 110 on them. Houston 110 in a touchdown. Miami 160 on the ground. Tennessee 122 in a touchdown. James Cook should find a lot of success against the Indianapolis Colts this week. Number 14, we have Tyrone Tracy Jr., the rookie running back of the New York Giants, who really has taken over. Again, just this most recent week, 72% of the overall snaps played and had himself 17 total running back touches in comparison to Singletary's 7. And all of Singletary's touches were on the ground in terms of rushing attempts. All the receiving workload and utilization going in the direction of Tyrone Tracy for another consecutive week. Again, as long as Tyrone Tracy is implicated to be the primary back of this offense, expect him to dominate, because thus far this season, amongst all running backs with 50 rushing attempts minimum, he is number 8 in terms of yards per carry on average, 4.97, and number 25 in terms of yards after contact per attempt with 3.01. He continues to be highly efficient in the opportunities given in his direction, and taking on the Carolina Panthers, the best matchup at the position. We would assume that Tyrone Tracy goes for one of his signature performances of over 100 total yards and potentially scoring a touchdown within the week. Number 15, we have Kareem Hunt, who again saved many of our fantasy weeks last night. Now, if you were on the other end of the Kareem Hunt, experience, and you ended up losing because of all the points that he racked up in overtime, that is the unfortunate situation of Baker Mayfield driving down the field and tying that game and sending it to overtime. They should have went for 2, honestly. But either way, when we talk about Kareem Hunt, the touches that he has most recently seen in the last 4 games, 28, 24, 22, and 28. He is a workhorse back in every sense of the word. He is continuing to score touchdowns every single week. And thanks to his overtime heroics and the fact that this offense continues to play better and better every single week here, he's continuing to put up great performances. They take on the Denver Broncos this week. The way to beat the Denver Broncos is shove the ball down their throat. We just most recently seen that from a lot of offenses. We're anticipating that to be the case for Kareem Hunt this week. Again, Derrick Henry ran right through them, over 100 yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. Hopefully Kareem Hunt can follow suit. Number 16 is Chase Brown. Now again, Chase Brown, as of right now, is playing on Thursday Night Football. We would assume that he is going to play, but as of this current moment in time, we have heard that Chase Brown is dealing with a bruised rib. Earlier today, they obviously traded for Khalil Herbert because Zach Moss is indefinitely out for the remainder of the season due to a neck injury. It could be a season and potentially career-ending injury for Zach Moss. We'll have to wait and see on that. That is an unfortunate circumstance, but as of right now, if Chase Brown is implicated to play, he's coming off of a week in which he, of course, played a ridiculous volume of snaps, had himself 32 total touches within this offense, and over 150 yards and a touchdown. As long as the opportunity is there, even though they take on the Baltimore Ravens, you go back to the last time he took on the Ravens, he had himself a great performance, finding himself in the end zone, double-digit total fantasy points. We would assume that, again, if he's active, ready to go, and healthy, that he's going to have himself another big performance here against the division rivals on Thursday night. Number 17 is Jonathan Taylor. The only thing that scares me is that if the Bills' defense is to lock up Joe Flacco because of how great their secondary has played over the course of the year, and they begin to ditch the running game, again, because of the negative game script and the overall kind of effectiveness of Josh Allen and the Bills' offense against that Colts defense, if something of that is to transpire, Jonathan Taylor will kind of be faded away within this offense. The main way to beat the Buffalo Bills is to establish the run early, which I'm hoping that, of course, Shane Steichen is going to be able to do, but they won't be able to accomplish that if, in fact, Joe Flacco isn't able to pull his overall weight. Obviously, Joe Flacco, I expect to play a lot better than he did last week against the Minnesota Vikings, but when we talk about these two defenses, the Vikings were the advantageous matchup. Going against the Bills, not an advantageous one. In fact, it probably should lead to the Colts losing another consecutive game here this week. Number 18 is James Conner. Look, James Conner's put up over 13 fantasy points in 7 of the last 9 games. And even though this last week, Amari Mercado and Trey Benson combined for 12 carries for 96 yards and 2 rushing touchdowns, if it wasn't for the fact that James Conner was pulled out on the 1-yard line because they wanted to test him for concussion protocol because he landed the wrong way, if it wasn't for the fact that they pulled him out of the game, he would have scored a rushing touchdown, had himself 20 points. And a great overall matchup. This week they take on the Jets. Again, most recently we have seen running backs from the Houston Texans, 128 in a touchdown on the ground. Pittsburgh, 146 in a touchdown on the ground. The Buffalo Bills ran for over 131 on the ground against the New York Jets recently. The expectation is that James Conner should continue his successful streak of 13-plus fantasy points and a half PPR with another big performance against the New York Jets run-stop defense this week. Number 19 is J.K. Dobbins. Man, even though I didn't expect much out of J.K. Dobbins last week, because again, he was taking on Cleveland's defense, Cleveland had only allowed 73 rushing yards to Derrick Henry. That was the most rushing yards they had allowed to a singular running back this season. But J.K. Dobbins comes into town, 14 carries for 85 yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, 23.5 fantasy points. And even though I didn't expect that to happen, of course, the defense causing 3 turnovers, And the offense for the Chargers playing significantly better every single week has led them in that direction. Now they take on the Tennessee Titans. Again, the Tennessee Titans have been a relatively strong run-stop defense, only allowing 3.81 yards per carry on average this season. If, in fact, that run-stop defense is going to continue to put themselves into positions to succeed, J.K. Dobbins may have himself a tougher overall performance. But, again, if the Los Angeles Chargers are going to find themselves scoring in bunches, expect for at least one of those touchdowns to go in the direction of J.K. Dobbins. Number 20, we have Tony Pollard. Now, again, I'm going to assume that despite the fact that he was injured all week last week, and they had him questionable going into Sunday's game, the fact that they gave him 31 touches is a ridiculous number. And I'm going to assume that his injury still exists with his foot because they continue to overutilize him. Going forward, like the offensive coordinator has said, they want to go ahead and kind of have a two-headed monster. They want to split the overall opportunity between him and Tyjae Spears. So with Tyjae Spears potentially returning this week, it will go ahead and kind of take away some of the overall opportunity from Tony Pollard, which again will keep him sustainable for the remainder of the season. There's no reason to run him 28 times within a singular game. I understand that they won the game, but man, Tony Pollard needs a break. He needs to run the ball 16 times, maybe catch it 4 times, and have himself 20 touches per game rather than 31. So going forward, I do expect less overall opportunity and therefore less overall upside within the overall circumstance. And the tough run-stopping defense of the Chargers definitely doesn't make it an easy overall matchup for him in this circumstance. Number 21, we have David Montgomery. He's coming off of, one of the best weeks in terms of overall touches that we have seen from him this season. 20 total touches. That's the most that he has had since week 3. And this is the highest overall snap percentage that he has seen all season long. Like I said earlier, when I talked about Jahmyr Gibbs, the entire first drive of the game was all David Montgomery. Jahmyr Gibbs did not play a single snap in that overall first drive. And even though David Montgomery wasn't able to score a touchdown on that first drive, on 4th and 1, they converted with Amon-Ra St. Brown running towards the pylon. Now, in this overall conversation, David Montgomery, in 2 of the last 3 weeks, has not scored a touchdown. That is a rare instance. Going forward, we would assume that he's going to find himself in the end zone. Taking on the Houston Texans, again, isn't the easiest overall matchup. But again, the Detroit Lions offense is unstoppable as of thus far this season. So we'd hope for David Montgomery to get his 60 yards and a touchdown. If not, hopefully the yardage is going to be enough to suffice within the given week. Number 22, we have Najee Harris. Coming off of the bye week, should be absolutely healthy, but not only that, should continue his momentum. Even though they do take on the Washington Commanders, whose defense has played incredibly well as of late, since week 6, Najee Harris has been averaging 16.7 fantasy points per game and 5.96 yards per carry on average. He's had himself over 100 rushing yards in each of the last 3 games and has scored 2 rushing touchdowns throughout that span of time. The Commanders thus far this season, allowing 16.83 fantasy points per game on the ground to opposing running backs, the 8th best matchup. Najee Harris, an immediate start within the upcoming matchup this week. Number 23, we have Rhamondre Stevenson. Now, even though Rhamondre Stevenson has scored 4 total touchdowns in the last 2 games, he has been highly inefficient. He is averaging 2.21 yards per carry on average in the last 3 games. Ridiculous numbers. Again, he only has like 60 rushing yards on 37 rushing attempts. Ridiculous numbers. So going into this week, taking on the Chicago Bears, again, it is the 6th best matchup. So we would assume that Rhamondre could still put together a solid performance, especially after the Arizona Cardinals last week went for 205 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns. The week prior, Washington 116 rushing yards, and Carolina the week before that, 103 and a touchdown. Rhamondre should be implicated to at least score his 1 touchdown, hopefully get enough yardage to maybe have like 40, 50, total yards in the overall conversation, maybe a couple receptions of a sprinkle, but the matchup should lead him to success because otherwise the volatility of those touchdowns not being implicated would lead him to being a far lesser overall option within the given week. Number 24, we have Chuba Hubbard. Now, the reason why Chuba Hubbard sits at number 24, despite the fact that they take on the New York Giants, a defense that just allowed, again, most recently, 114 on the ground and a touchdown to the Washington Commanders, 160 to the Pittsburgh Steelers, 247 and a touchdown to the Philadelphia Eagles. Again, they're a middle-of-the-pack matchup, but as of late have been getting torched. The reason why Chuba Hubbard sits at 24 is because Jonathan Brooks is expected to be active this week. Jonathan Brooks has practiced each of the last 2 weeks at a full capacity and should be unleashed going forward. So with this overall situation, we should see less opportunities going in the direction of Chuba Hubbard, therefore less upside in the overall circumstance. Now, I do expect him to continue to lead this backfield as of right now, but again, less opportunity means less fantasy points. Number 25, we have Bijan Robinson Jr., who was in kind of surprise inactive on Sunday morning. Now, again, he has missed 2 of the last 4 games due to injury, most recently dealing with a hamstring injury. That was the current designation. Now, if in fact he's going to miss another week, of course, Austin Ekeler will be in this number 25 overall conversation, if not overall higher ranked. But going forward, again, we got to remember this is a running back that thus far this season, when healthy in a half PPR, is averaging 13.5 fantasy points per game in the last 7 healthy games he has played. So as long as he is healthy and active, he is in our lineups in a solid RB2 within the upcoming conversation. Number 26, we have Bucky Irving, who, even though he played 35% of the snaps last night against the Chiefs, he handled 50% of the overall running back touches. And he has done that each of the last 2 weeks, in which even in the return of Rachaad White, he is continuing to get himself the bulk majority of the overall touches in this backfield. As long as they prefer to give him the vast majority of the touches, taking on the San Francisco 49ers, again, they're allowing 13.11 on the ground to opposing running backs. We have seen running backs each of the last 3 games score against them. We would hope that Baker Mayfield is going to keep this a competitive game and hopefully help Bucky Irving not only get the receptions, but maybe find the end zone within the goal line conversation. Number 27, we have Rico Dowdle. Look, even though Rico Dowdle was highly efficient in his overall touches given, again, 8 of his overall 12 rushing attempts this last week led to 4 or more rushing yards. Those are great numbers. And even though he's been able to average 4.85 yards per carry in the last 4 games he has played, in the last 2 games, getting himself 12 targets, 10 receptions, 62 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown, going forward, it's purely just going to be a matter of, is Cooper Rush capable of getting him down to the red zone? Is this offense capable of scoring? Because the checkdowns are going to be in the conversation. The negative game script is certainly going to be there. He will be the primary rusher of this offense. But going forward, if we're looking for upside, it is going to primarily have to come from the receiving workload rather than the rushing yards, because when they're down 20 plus points to the Eagles, it's not going to be a pretty conversation to be running the ball up the gut. Number 28, we have Austin Ekeler. Again, if Austin Ekeler is going to be the primary starting running back in the absence of another missing week from Bijan Robinson Jr., expect him to be in the top 23, if not higher ranked running backs, because he's coming off another great week in which he was able to have himself 83 all-purpose yards, a rushing touchdown, 3 receptions, 15.8 half PPR fantasy points. And again, in the absence of the starting back, this offensive line has played incredibly well. It doesn't matter who's running behind them, they're going to find success. Taking on Pittsburgh, if Austin Ekeler is going to have to split the backfield, again, he is still going to be relevant. Thus far this season, he's typically a 6 to 10 point guy. With the upside of a touchdown always implicated, could be an even better play within a given week. Number 29 is Rachaad White. Again, even though he played the bulk majority of the overall snaps, he only accounted for 30% of the overall running back touches in week 9. 6 of the total 20 touches, 3 rushing attempts, and 3 receptions. Yes, he was lucky enough to score a rushing touchdown, but the yardage doesn't justify it. Again, 16 receiving yards on 3 receptions and 19 rushing yards on 3 rushing attempts. I understand that the game script had this team having to throw the ball for the majority of the game, and a lot of 3-and-out situations continue to pile up. But again, the matchup upcoming against the San Francisco 49ers, fully healthy with Juwan Jennings back, Christian McCaffrey back, this offensive line feeling refreshed, hopefully. They're going to be able to barrel down the ball and kill the clock against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Hopefully, Rachaad White's going to be able to find himself enough opportunity to be relevant, even with Bucky Irving getting the majority of the touches out of the backfield. Number 30 is Raheem Mostert, taking on the LA Rams again. You got to remember, this is a top-tier matchup, but not only that, when we talk about Raheem Mostert, it's purely just a matter of him scoring touchdowns. If he doesn't score a touchdown, he is not going to be hyper-relevant for fantasy purposes. Over the course of the last 3 games in which he has been healthy, weeks 7 through 9, averaging 10 touches per game on the ground and 4.17 yards per carry. He has fumbled twice in the last 3 games, which again, if he continues to fumble, expect Jaylen Warren to take over his job. But as long as he continues to get his 10 touches per game, he's always implicated for a potential, let's say, 6 to 12 fantasy points within a given week. Moving on to Javonte Williams, our number 31, taking on the Kansas City Chiefs, the most difficult matchup at the position, allowing literally just 3 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs. We did hear that Audric Estime is going to get himself more touches going into the week, but the fact of the matter is, in a negative game script, a lot of it is going to go in the direction of Javonte Williams within the checkdowns. Therefore, I expect Javonte Williams to be relevant for another consecutive week because of his receiving workload. He still will get a sprinkle of rushing opportunity, just not at a higher capacity than we typically see, because again, they're going to be in a negative game script, taking on the Kansas City Chiefs. Typically, you don't want to run the ball against them. Tank Bigsby is our number 32. The starting running back of the Jacksonville Jaguars is Tank Bigsby, but the issue is, if he's only going to play 52% of the snaps, only going to see himself 8 rushing attempts for 22 yards against the Philadelphia Eagles, taking on the Minnesota Vikings isn't going to get much easier. They're probably going to have to ditch the running game relatively early, and when they do so, considering Tank Bigsby's coming off of a week in which he had 0 total targets, even though he outran Etienne in terms of total routes ran, even though he outran him 15 to 12, in that overall conversation, if you're not getting the targets, it does not matter. The opportunity is all we want, and unfortunately, he is not being exposed to that as of late. Number 33, we have Jaylen Warren. Look, the fact of the matter is, in each of the last 2 games, 10 or more touches. As long as he is continuing to get himself that kind of volume of opportunity, he is going to be a 7 to 10 point fantasy point running back within a given week. Taking on the Commanders, of course, is an upside matchup, the 8th best at the position. We're just hoping for him to get the more valuable touches, which is receptions out of the backfield. Number 34 is Jonathan Brooks, the rookie running back, who is expected to return for his first game and his first debut of his NFL career. Taking on the Giants is a great way to start because, again, the Giants, as of late, have allowed 114 in the touchdown to the Washington Commanders running backs, 160 running yards to the Pittsburgh Steelers running backs, and 247 in a touchdown to the Eagles running backs. Therefore, Jonathan Brooks will be given the opportunity. The vast majority still going in the direction of Chuba Hubbard. But again, if you go ahead and potentially sprinkle him with 8 to 10 touches, should be a top 36 running back within the given week. Number 35, we have Travis Etienne, who again played 31% of the snaps, had a total of 6 opportunities and 5 touches. And again, even though he ran less routes than Tank Bigsby, got himself the overall targets. The fact of the matter is, this backfield is something that I want no association with. I do not want to start these players, but if in fact you have to, again, Travis Etienne still valuable enough because of the opportunities given in the circumstance in a negative game script in which maybe he can come away with 4 or 5 receptions within an upcoming performance against the Minnesota Vikings. Number 36 is Tyjae Spears. Again, they want this backfield to be a two-headed monster. We're going to have to wait and see how they want to kind of distribute the overall opportunities, but expect Tyjae Spears to potentially get himself 8 to 10 touches within the upcoming week. Even though it is a difficult matchup against the Chargers, we're hoping that the vast majority of those are within the receiving game because, as we all know, those are far more valuable in a half PPR, full PPR setting. Number 37 is Ray Davis. Again, like I mentioned yesterday in the waiver wire episode, even though in each of the last 3 games he's only being given 6 total touches, he has technically still scored a touchdown in 2 of the last 3 games, which makes him fantasy relevant. And against the Colts, if they blow them out, could get a garbage time touchdown once again. Then we move on to the overall conversation of Tyler Allgeier. Speaking of stealing touchdowns in garbage time, he did that last week to Bijan Robinson. But the last time they took on the New Orleans Saints back in week 4, in that game, Tyler Allgeier, 8 carries for 60 rushing yards, 2 receptions for 20 receiving yards, all for 9.0 fantasy points. Could have himself another relevant week, especially while they're blowing out the New Orleans Saints defense that cannot stop the run. Moving on to our number 39, we have Roschon Johnson. Again, in the last 5 weeks, Roschon Johnson has been averaging 6.2 touches per game and 7.42 fantasy points per game. The Patriots are the second best matchup at the position, allowing 18.42 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. They have allowed over 110 rushing yards in each of the last 6 games to opposing running backs. Therefore, we're anticipating Roschon Johnson to still be relevant even with DeAndre Swift getting the bulk majority of the overall touches. The final running back I wanted to mention and kind of transition into the conversation of the trade deadline is Khalil Herbert. Now again, Khalil Herbert earlier today was traded to the Cincinnati Bengals due to the overall neck injury of Zach Moss. Very unfortunate, but going forward, we know that this backfield likes to utilize 2 running backs. Even when Chase Brown had shown he was the more significant running back in terms of overall efficiency, as a receiving back, as a back up the middle, didn't matter. Chase Brown was the better back, but they continue to utilize Zach Moss every single week. Therefore, expect Khalil Herbert to be utilized in that same form. Now, am I going to kind of adjust my overall prioritization of Khalil Herbert in comparison to yesterday's video? Absolutely. I would probably rank him right behind Jaylen Warren. He would be the number 2 running back that I am trying to target and go after and pick up going into this week. If in fact he is available, be sure to do so. Now, when we continue the conversation of the trade deadline, let's talk about someone like Mike Williams. Even though he is not a running back, Mike Williams, now a new Pittsburgh Steeler, landing with that overall organization after the trade. Mike Williams, in the overall context of our waiver wire wide receiver rankings, would be our number 4 just behind Demarcus Robinson. Could be ahead of him, but again, don't expect much out of Mike Williams this week because, like we have seen from DeAndre Hopkins, Amari Cooper, and Deontay Johnson this season, the first week of a wide receiver with a new team, expect 0 fantasy points. So if you need something this week, again, you would prefer the top 3 options, and Mike Williams would be the number 4 where Jalen Tolbert was ranked yesterday. That's going to cover it in regards to my Week 10 running back rankings. Thank you, everybody, for watching. If you haven't yet already, subscribe, click the like button down below. Again, I'll be live starting at 7 p.m. PST later tonight. I want to thank you all for watching. Again, I'll be back tomorrow talking about my top 40 wide receiver rankings. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.